Open Your Eyes is brought to you by the Belize Bank. Our country, your bank.
Welcome to Open Your Eyes, start your morning right. I'm Marlene Cuellar, and thank you for joining us this morning. It is a nice, cool Wednesday morning. What a way to approach hump day. And, I gotta say, it's a cold front, but it's a really enjoyable one. One, it's dry. And two, it's not too cold. It might be a little bit cozy in bed though, so you got to get out and get moving. We're going to be checking in on our weather in just a bit and finding out just how long the cool temperatures are going to stick around. And we're going to go ahead actually and read our prepared forecast. So the general situation for today is for the high pressure ridge to continue to support cool and dry conditions over the area.
Excellent. And for the 24-hour forecast, variably cloudy and cool conditions with little or no rainfall is expected.
All right, or temperatures. Oh, the winds. The winds are moving from the north to northwest at 5 to 15 knots, and it's gonna move to the northeast at 5 to 15 knots. And that means a moderate to rough sea state, and a small craft caution is in effect for locally rough seas.
Well, that sounds good, but let's take a look at the temperatures for today. Highs will be 75 degrees Fahrenheit along the coast, 78 inland, and only 70 up in the hills.
All right, and tonight, ooh, it's gonna be good for sleep.
It's gonna be good.
70 degrees Fahrenheit along the coast, 64 degrees inland, and 60 in the hills.
Which allows us to move on now to the outlook for Thursday and Thursday night. It is for similar weather conditions to prevail. That's some good news.
That's right. And we want to thank Shania Young from the National Met Service for providing that update for this morning.
Excellent.
Like I said, it's cool and it's comfortable.
It's nice.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, it's like a well-regulated AC all day long, right? Not the ones that you walk in and it's like it's freezing.
Yeah, it allows you to keep the Lasco at only 3, not 1. Because it could be chilly. It could be
I know,
chilly.
some people will keep that fan on no matter what temperature it is. The biggest joke I saw was one person who said, yeah, the fan's on, it's just not turned on to me.
It's just not turned on to me. And it's so funny, listening to the sound of the fan makes you feel that you're getting some cool air.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. All right, we're going to keep things moving this morning, and we're going to get into a bit of motivation to get your day started. And that means it's time for our Eye Opener. Our Eye Opener is taken from dailyom.com, and it goes like this. True leaders create an environment in which everyone can develop their potential. When we call someone a leader, what we sometimes mean is that they're the best in their particular field. They're inspiring because of how much they accomplish. To be highly accomplished is impressive, but that isn't what leadership is about. True leaders are not just high achievers. They also support the people around them to achieve, and in certain cases, to become leaders themselves. In other words, true leaders do not create a static group of followers. True leaders don't get so caught up in the forward thrust of their own energy that they forget about others or the larger environment. They set an example with their actions, and they also support others to act. This is why true leadership is so rare. It's also possible that we have determined that our gifts are best applied in a secondary position, supporting the efforts of a leader whose vision we admire. In this case, we can ensure that our energy is best applied by holding the person for whom we work to a high standard of leadership. In this way, we take responsibility for our own gifts by guaranteeing that they will be appreciated and developed in a way that best serves the whole.
I really, 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 really want for everybody to stick this up in their office. I want for households to have it. Because look, while we've got mom and dad in the home, they're the head, the leader of the home.
Yeah.
They are the head of the home. And what they do is that they lead their children
Yeah.
to the promised land. Simply means that their child or children becomes successful because of leadership, and it transcends afterwards. The same with the workplace, the work environment that we are in. If there is somebody there who could help you bring out much more of your potential because they see it, or even if they don't see it, give somebody the ability to, give the trust, enable that individual to bring something out of them, and you'll see how far we'll propel. Look, in a workplace, in a household, there is only one promised land, and it takes the entire crew to get there with a leader.
Absolutely. I find that this is more and more becoming a part of the wider conversation.
Yes.
In workplaces and of course in families as well. Leadership skills are so important, and we have to be clear. There's always a hierarchy, especially in companies or even in families.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the top of the chain is a good leader. They may be in charge, but that doesn't make them a good leader.
That's right.
And what differentiates, I think, a really good leader is exactly what the opening statement says. It allows people to achieve their potential. And imagine that in your family, in your household. Imagine it with identifying gifts that your kids have that others may not be able, especially young girls. Little girls aren't encouraged to be leaders.
Yes.
Imagine encouraging that and having them achieve all that they can based on the qualities that they possess that are good rather than focusing on the bad. And it is the same, I think, in any other organization or system that you possess. We tend to be very punitive, we tend to be very suppressive, and I mean, it could go way back into history and how we're socialized, but I think we feel many times that there's just space for one. And so it's a protective system, you know, the power, the information. It's most important that I hold on to it. But if you're not helping to nurture other leaders, and if you're not helping to nurture people within your family or your organization to grow beyond what they even know they're possible of, then you're not looking towards the end goal of just having better people produce more.
Definitely. And as you know, as you say goal, it also, my mind went directly to the football field, whereby, yes, you will have a captain, but a captain does not run a team. The captain makes sure that everything is A-OK, calls the plays, and the captain must see the true potential in the forward, the midfield, and of course his defense line. And strengthen them. And if everybody carry out the play called by the captain, they'll score many goals. And people need to understand these things, because we're living in a lifetime, especially in our country, and especially in our little country, where we find much more suppressors in the workplace rather than folks to say, you've got true potential, let's go this way. Do you realize that if all of us go to the same spot because all of us have got our own potential, how many goals we can score? Come on, man. Let's do it the right way.
Absolutely. So I think this is such a great eye-opener.
Of course.
And I love that you opened with the fact that it starts within the family.
It does. It does. Your household, your sporting club, you know, it doesn't matter where you go, as long as there must be somebody that rear his or her head as, you know what, that's the person we want to follow. You know, so a wonderful eye-opener, wonderful eye-opener. And one more thing on the eye-opener, it reminds me of back in 2000 at Faculty of Agriculture and Natural Resources, being an agricultural student, and there are times we had to go out for livestock, and there was this herd of cattle, and you could corral them, but if that one leader turned back, everybody turned back.
Yeah.
Every jack one. And it's so amazing to see that one leads and everybody follows. I love it. I really and truly love you. You got my mind to go. I love it. But while our mind is going, I'll tell you what. I'll make your mind go. We'll make your mind go as well, because we've got our morning tea coming up. Woof, I love it. I could smell that fever grass or lemongrass tea going on. And it goes a little something like this. Now check this out. Put your mind to work. Is there any such thing as an honest politician? Is it a realistic expectation? That's the question. That's the question. Yeah, tea mixing there.
Yeah.
Please don't put lot of sugar.
So
Take your
do
time.
remember, these are conversation starters for today. You get into the office place, you're having breakfast, you're about to take your commute. You know, just get the conversation started.
I tell you, and then you
This
get
is one that I think would get really feisty.
It would because of the politician situation in there, and then asking the question if there is any such thing as an honest politician. Well, some people might go into it, and it's so unfortunate that this is my thought process, this is just how I feel because of what we've seen. A lot of people go into it with that honest mentality, but I think having to see the purse for some reason or the other, that's when things just steer on elsewhere. And a lot of people, I'm sure, feels just like that. You're there voting for somebody because you feel that that individual is honest, and what they're saying is exactly what you want to hear, you know, and probably from the heart at that particular time. But at the same time, when they get there, it is another situation.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and we do have some feedback online. We have
cool.
Dennis Johnson saying yes, and we have Edith Ferrier saying definitely. You know, I think that clearly we're in a situation where there is a lot of cynicism about the people who are elected officials or people who are going up for elections. And I think this is really a two-part question. It's looking at the idea of an honest politician, which there are many jokes about that one, that it would be an oxymoron, but also whether it's a realistic expectations. And it's two separate things. It's whether, what we expect, and it's also who they are. There are honest people in this world. It is, I think no one can deny that there are people who have really good intentions. The challenge we have is really the system. In my opinion, it's the system that we're in. We can have people who have good intentions, and as a matter of fact, the only way they can affect some of the changes that you'd like to see in a wider communities is in fact by getting themselves into a position of leadership.
Of leadership, yes.
The challenge comes with getting into that position. And that's where we have the hardest time being able to recognize that our behavior as voters, the things we pay attention to, the things we engage in and question about the people who want to be in elected office, that we have that role. So we should have that expectation. And we have to follow through with it with our actions. You know, having proper systems in place. Recently, the talk has been about campaign financing reform. There's the declaration of assets. There's several things that is existing in our regulations and laws, and there are things that we definitely need to include, but there has to be proper enforcement, and it has to be meaningful. Because I can be an honest person wanting to seek office to affect meaningful change in this country, but there are two things that will hold me back. One, I have to get there. That requires financing. And when someone who has a lot of money is able to help me get there, what am I indebted to later on? And that's already degraded the whatever ethical component I was going in with. And secondly, I think that it's also looking at what we spoke of earlier, the leadership. You know, if you have a leader who, not for face value or lip service, says, you know, we're going to be truthful and honest, but really shows and exemplifies that that is what you hope, and you will work your best, because you can't fight all evil in this world. But that is what you're going to work towards, then naturally it creates a more enabling environment for the people who fall under that leader.
Definitely.
So there are other influential factors as well.
Definitely.
Does the end justify the means? Well, that's a question we can go on to all day. So
Yeah.
the honest person makes unethical decisions in getting into office. Does that still make them honest?
You know, I do feel though to put the shut door on this particular topic, that it's up to the people to make sure that that politician becomes honest. Hold that individual to his or her his or her word.
Yeah.
If this is what you said that you were going to do, then let's do it.
Yeah.
People need to understand that the masses are the bosses. We going out there to vote because this is how we feel, or you've said to us that this is what's going to happen. Then let's see it happen. Yeah. And I think the people hold the key to honesty.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We have to keep them honest.
We have to keep them honest.
Or make them honest in some cases.
So what do you say you get on your social media platform and you have that discussion on there, or right there in your office, you could have that discussion as well. Don't forget, you could always chime in with us as well, ask your question and say how you feel. We love to hear that.
All right.
And we need to move on in this morning's program.
We're done stirring it up for this morning.
Stir it up. Yeah, we did that.
John, I just said it was a dry day. Don't change it. All right, so we got our first conversation lined up.
Yeah, we've got, for the first conversation, this is definitely a topic that has been running like a big fish in water, which is actually the Equal Opportunities Draft Bill. We'll have the authorities in to tell us all about it and try to provide an explanation to you so everybody could understand what's going on.
All right, and the second part of our show, we're preparing for International Customs Day. So we're going to have representatives from the Customs Department on to tell us why we celebrate this day and how we're going to be celebrating it in Belize as well.
All right, and in the third segment, you're going to love this. I love it. That's actually Porgy and Bess.
This is why you shouldn't sing, because we have professionals coming in later on.
Yeah, professionals are coming in. And I watched the video and I was like, woo, this is tough. It tells a story. So opera in our country, and of course there'll be auditions coming up. So if you feel that you've got what it takes, you want to listen to this one to find out where to go to audition.
So that's what we have lined up for this morning. We're going to take a break, but before we do, we got that birthday shout out.
That's right, and we want to say a big, big happy birthday as we do a shout out to Stephanie Hamilton. Happy birthday to you, Stephanie, coming from all of us right here at Channel 5 on Open Your Eyes. Happy birthday. And we're about to take that break. When we come back, we'll be jumping into our first segment, so stay with us.
With over 100 years of service,
And welcome back to Open Your Eyes on a very, very cool Wednesday morning. We're about to kick things off with one of the hot topics that have been resonating over the past 2 weeks, I'd say 3 weeks. Equal Opportunities Draft Bill. Now, in to talk to us about it, we've got Judith Alpuche, who is the CEO in the Ministry of Human Development, Social Transformation and Poverty Alleviation. And also in with us this morning is Rashad Brathwaite, who is an attorney at law and consultant. Guys, good morning and welcome. And allow us to say Happy New Year.
Thank
We
you.
were still going to say it.
You still can say that, right?
Yes, so, you know, this draft bill has definitely been hitting our country like a wildfire. And I think more so because of all that is within the bill. For the most part, a lot of people are seeing one way out of it. I think what we need to do is to provide some clarity so everybody could get on the equilibrium with what's going on with this bill. Once again, good morning, and let's jump on into it. CEO, please,
Yes,
introduction.
and thank you so much after that introduction for having us and for allowing us the space to really talk about it and educate. And you know, the media is an invaluable ally and tool in this regard to try to get to address some of the issues. So we've done the public consultations and as was said, and we've listened very keenly and intently to people's concerns. And just to say from the onset that what we're trying to accomplish with this Equal Opportunities Bill is to give life to our Constitution. It is really to operationalize those promises that are set out in our Constitution that speaks to the fact that we're all equal under the law, and that in certain categories are laid out where we should not face discrimination. Age, race or ethnicity, religion, sex, etc. And so it's really about how do you operationalize that? How do people access that? How does the government be proactive in really creating enabling environments, setting up frameworks where people don't face discrimination? And we have been talking about this for a long, long time in the sector. Marlene, you know, being in the sector, we started these conversations in earnest around stigma and discrimination having to do with people living with HIV and AIDS. And I can remember as a child protection worker, you know, having to deal with the fact that some children could not access education, not because they were positive, but because they were orphans due to HIV and AIDS, or because somebody heard some rumor that a parent was HIV positive. Whether or not that was so was another matter. But children would face incredible discrimination, much less those living with the disease. And we, you know, we've talked about this, about how stigma and discrimination really drives people underground, not accessing proper health care, etc. So that's the reason why, too, the National AIDS Commission is leading this charge, because those conversations have happened for 2 decades within that space. But we've also noted that as we look around in sectors having to do with women, children, persons with disability, etc., that you see other manifestations of discrimination. And so instead of, you know, just using the CARICOM model bill that this, our Equal Opportunities Bill is based on, instead of narrowly putting something forward that just deals with stigma and discrimination having to do with HIV/AIDS, we looked at 19 other characteristics for people who are experiencing discrimination in various ways. Or some of the things that we had to deal with in terms of, you'll see a number of issues having to do with maternity, pregnancy, breastfeeding, family responsibility, which disproportionately affect women, especially as we're living longer. Women of my age are being squashed in between child care and the care of the elderly. So how do we balance all of that with the realities of having to put bread on the table? So because of that, we said, let's do something more comprehensive. And we were lucky enough to get Rashad on board.
You know, I think what you're opening with is perhaps one of the critical parts of the conversation that we've not heard, at least publicly, which is looking at the evidence that is driving the need for the legislation. We talk about stigma and discrimination. I think it's a very loose term, but there are actually practical ways that people have suffered,
Absolutely.
or gotten the wrong end of the stick in this country. So let's talk about what data does exist that showed that there was a need for this type of legislation.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for having me. I've really gotten to see over the course of the public consultations the beauty of Belize, so truly it's an honor to be here. So let's talk about the data. Firstly, we start with the high levels of prevalence. So for 240 to 250 infections annually over the last 10 years or so, and the mortality rates being about 110 to 130 persons who are dying from HIV. In a world where HIV of 1990s and 2000s, with the medicine that we now have, need not be a death sentence. And so the stories of persons who, because of the stigma that is associated with going to the healthcare facility. So before you leave the testing facility, your result is known in the community, or even the fact that you went to a particular facility, because that is known as the place where persons with HIV go for service. So people have left. I was listening to a story as we moved around. Some person said, look, I've got someone who, because they did not want to have to go through all of the rumors associated with accessing healthcare, died leaving 4 kids in a world where that is not necessary. So that's the HIV data. There's a human rights monitoring framework, a shared incident database, for which there's evidence of in the last 2 years or so, more than 250 instances of discrimination, and these range from physical violence, breaches of confidentiality, evictions from accommodation, terminations from work. And so there's a considerable body of evidence related to HIV. PANCAP and other agencies have been doing incredible work in attempting to build the evidence base for the ways in which stigma and discrimination affect persons living with HIV, but this isn't just about HIV. We've looked at the levels of female participation in the labor force, and where that is lower than many counterparts across the region. And then when we look into areas like the level of employment for persons living with disabilities, the level of employment for persons living with disabilities is incredibly low, and this is perhaps true across the region. And for me, certainly on the question of disability, one of my closest friends, and when friends are family, my cousin who has a disability and who, because he had parental support that could fight for him, having to negotiate, look, my kid is brilliant and it should be able to access mainstream secondary schooling, who now has 2 master's degrees, and is very much, leading in his field. But what he was told is that because he had a disability, that he should attend a school that was not a mainstream school, and that did not provide certification, so that that's some of the
But it took advocacy
it's an
on behalf
incredible
of the
advocacy.
parents.
And so where you aren't not, that's a child with disability doesn't have that choice about their parent. And so that's where the law becomes important.
Well, see, that's the question I have, because I think even on this show, we have had several conversations with vulnerable groups identifying situations of discrimination, from people from the LGBT community losing jobs, being evicted from their homes. We had a recent father who spoke of, his son being discriminated at work to the point where he stopped taking medication and eventually lost his battle with HIV. We have had conversations with people about breastfeeding in the workplace. We speak very often about women and their challenges in terms of being able to maintain the household and keep their work going. I think that these instances do exist, but my question is, even with disability, for example, there are other policies that already exist for inclusive education, for breastfeeding in the workplace, for equal access to education, and in some parts not being discriminated for your HIV status, right? So why is this an essential component to be added to our legislation if these policies already exist?
You have.
It's really, I mean, we've heard that question, and a part of it has also been, but the legislation isn't working, or you know, these policies. So this is about how do you put forth a mechanism to assist with these situations, because even when things exist, like even when you have precedent, for instance, like I'll take like the Maria Roches case, you know, that clearly that's established, but yet you still hear teachers saying that they have been fired and they are not able to access the courts for judicial review, so they just give up. I know of one woman who left the country, really good teacher, left the country because she didn't even want to start this fight because she thought she would lose, you know, and she didn't have the wherewithal. So this is where, you know, a part of what I like about this legislation is the whole positive obligations also that it puts on the states to look at these frameworks. A classic example, for instance, of laws that have already been in place but don't work is our Sexual Harassment Act. That's, and Mr. Brathwaite has said this is like a really good piece of legislation, but there's no mechanism for it to work. And so it's never been used. And you will not tell me that sexual harassment does not exist in Belize. I have heard and overheard the stories.
And many of us have experienced it.
Indeed, many of us have experienced it. But so it's how do you operationalize these things, you know?
Wouldn't we say that you know, it's hard to try to put to mind that as much as some of these things are already being tabled, for instance, sexual harassment, and they're not being looked upon as serious as they're supposed to be, wouldn't we then say that, you know what, that's the onus of the authorities? Because look, what this bill actually does, it actually clears the path now for generations 2. For when they get into it, then eventually we'll have a freer world. We talk about free world, and we've heard, especially in the mighty USA, that these things are already being enrolled. I still boil down back to my question, wouldn't we say the onus is on the authorities to make sure that these things are being dealt with?
So the bill is 75 pages, but section,
I've seen it.
there are 127 sections. Sections 55 to 127 are about the operation of the commission and the tribunal. Because the strength of the institutions, that's significantly important. So firstly, let's talk a bit about the public sector equal opportunities duties. And this is new. There is no other jurisdiction in the region that places a positive obligation that can be enforced on public authorities in the conduct of their work to have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination. And that might mean looking at the ways in which your budget allocations are functioning, your programmatic directions. And so when you are working and there is an uneven rural-urban divide, which then may interact with ethnicity and race, there is now a mechanism for review. And the Commission has significant powers working with other government entities to request reviews for compliance, to provide compliance notice. Look, we need to see this plan that shows the ways in which you have considered this. And evidence from where positive obligations have been implemented demonstrates that that exercise, that yields significant results in the way that public authorities engage with their work, because they have to think about these things. Reasonable adjustments for disabilities. This now places an obligation on an employer to make those changes where it doesn't result in an unjustifiable hardship, meaning a disproportionate burden. In many cases, what is required in order to allow for accommodations and adjustment is thought. and we can think through adjustments and accommodations. There are those that are free and require thought. There's those that are relatively inexpensive and can be quickly implemented. But there is nothing that says, if the choice is, I will hire someone that doesn't have a disability so that I don't have to deal with any of this, then that becomes the choice.
But how does the bill reduce the burden of proof? We have instances in this country where people have lost their jobs because their HIV status has become disclosed. And that's two issues. That's one, losing your job, but also the confidentiality issue, which already exists in the healthcare system, that you should not say who's been tested, who's positive, or who's negative. So that already exists. But when you talk about going to a labor force tribunal, for example, as one of the current instances, or even if it's sexual harassment and the confidentiality issue comes up, does this help in terms of being able to reduce one of the greatest challenges, which is being able to prove that they didn't want to hire me because I'm pregnant, or they fired me because I'm HIV positive, or my child is too sickly, so they fired me because of that reason?
Yeah. So the legislation addresses this in a couple of ways. Firstly, there is a body dedicated to investigation in the form of the commission. So that firstly, the commission, and we've been very much trying to emphasize this, that the commission is trying for alternative dispute settlement so that we don't have to end up at court. But the commission provides a free mechanism for the investigation of complaints so that the commission can dismiss a complaint if it is trivial. But substantively, what we've really spent a lot of time, certainly I have, in looking at what are the mechanisms that have worked across the world to increase transparency and to allow for better engagement. So how does this work in this context? Firstly, the Commission has a statutory questionnaire which will, when a claim is raised, an employer service provider will have to reply to this questionnaire in response to the allegation. And so where it is that there's one thing that's been told to the individual, another thing that's been told to the labor officer, and then something else that now pops up in response, we're seeing some variance in the duty holders' responses, and the court can take into account to make an adverse inference on the basis that there's something that is not adding up here. Now, and this is true of constitutional discrimination, what I'm about to say. It was recognized that when you brought a constitutional claim for discrimination, if you had, or breach of any right, if you had to prove the breach of the right, that it was almost impossible because the state authority was usually the one who had the information. So what this legislation does, which when you're doing any case relating to a breach of a human right protected under the Constitution, is that it reverses the burden of proof. If you have established that there is some merit in this case, the burden then shifts to the duty holder to say, look, I did not act in a discriminatory manner. And so let's say in the case of employment, if there's a clear criteria for hiring, we've looked at qualifications, we've looked at the strength of your application, we've looked at your cover letter, and there is a clear, transparent framework, then it's very easy to say, look, you were not the most qualified candidate. But where it is that you've got, you are clearly the most qualified candidate, and there's no other substantial barrier, then why was this woman not hired? That becomes a real question. Now, it will always, and anywhere where anti-discrimination legislation or equal opportunities legislation is in place, it is always difficult, this question of evidence. But what we know is that by providing these sorts of framework, it gives persons who've been discriminated against a fairer chance to bring this to light.
So for those who are willing to take on the fight, because that's also one of the challenges.
Better than that, we've been, so firstly, the Commission, in exceptional circumstances, where there might be a case of systemic discrimination, or, so often there is a video that comes out of a clear instance of discrimination, but individuals may say, look, I don't want to move forward with this because I will not be the martyr for this cause. The Commission can bring an action on behalf of persons. Significantly, there's been a whole lot of work in the region about who can bring a claim. And so we've extended the protection so that an organization could bring a claim on behalf of an individual. So your union might be best placed to bring this. If you are being discriminated on the basis of religion, a religious organization may be best placed to bring this, because this is an issue. Discrimination is not just an individual question. It is about the way in which persons who belong to a group feel, so that when a person is discriminated because they're a person of faith, then other persons of faith likewise may fear that that is acceptable, and that their right to freedom of religion might likewise be affected.
This particular consultation for the Equal Opportunities Bill falls at an interesting time. It was very recently that the Court of Appeal reaffirmed the ruling on Section 53. And I think that that has kind of been the entry into the conversation, where a lot of the focus on the Equal Opportunities Bill has been on the LGBT community and how some religious institutions feel about how much that affects their personal beliefs. I want to take the opportunity to get into that. We've seen the National Evangelical Association of Belize speak out publicly. In fact, they're the only religious institution to do so. Have you approached other religious institutions, the Roman Catholics, for example, who are in fact the largest denomination in this country, about 40%. So they represent 40%, based on the old census, 40% of the people who subscribe to that faith. Have you been proactive in being able to speak to other religious institutions to get a sense of what they're feeling on this issue?
Yes, we did, as a matter of fact, have a meeting with the Belize Council of Churches this week. My days are running together now. To talk about the issues, and they had some of the same concerns around religious freedoms, etc. But even prior to drafting this bill, Mr. Brathwaite was in country and spoke to people, and the whole issue of the religious freedoms came up, and so you will see the protections are very strong. Very strong in the draft, no? We were able to put together a document that addresses all the issues that we have heard in terms of the religious concerns. So
let's get into some of these. One of the first assumptions is that this allows for people to, the LGBT community, to get married. Same-sex marriage is now allowed if this passes. True or not true?
Not true.
Not true.
We've provided now explicit coverage in the legislation that provides that nothing in this legislation affects the operation of the Marriage Act. The legislation never could have affected the Marriage Act because this legislation doesn't regulate marriage. So there's a provision that says if any conflict relating to a matter that is dealt with under this act comes into conflict with a piece of legislation, another piece of legislation, that this legislation will prevail. But that requires for there to be an area that is capable of conflict, and we've added language just for clarity, so that, if I can very quickly explain the way that the conflict works. The labor code requires a medical when you start working, but it doesn't specify the nature of that medical. And so an employer very well may say, we need you to provide an HIV test. We know that that is not effective from a public health perspective. And the Equal Opportunities legislation, the HIV prevention and cure component, says that that's prohibited. So there's now a conflict between those provisions. In that event, the Equal Opportunities legislation must prevail, and it would be unlawful to request an HIV test in those circumstances.
So what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that if the issue is addressed in the Equal Opportunities Bill, and there's another law that is in conflict with what is addressed in the Equal Opportunities Bill, then this is the overriding legislation.
This is the overriding legislation after 2 years.
After 2 years, okay. But what you're clarifying in terms of the marriage issue is that the Equal Opportunities Bill says nothing about marriage.
It does not deal with marriage.
Which is why it would not be an overarching legislation over the Marriage Act.
The only area of reference to marriage is discrimination on the basis of marital status, which is in accordance with the laws of Belize.
Okay.
And so, no, we don't regulate or attempt to address the question of marriage. Marriage
Between
remains
a man and a woman.
Yeah.
And one of the things too that really I think needs to be highlighted is that the religious protections there is its own protection against this kind of thing, because if your sacrament within your religion says that marriage, the sacrament of marriage or whatever you call it, whatever word you use to call marriage, you can tell I'm Catholic, so I use sacrament, says that that's between a man and a woman, then this protects you from that. You
don't
cannot
have
be
to
forced
change what your denomination or religious affiliation allows for.
Yeah.
Now,
you can't be forced to, even if the Marriage Act were to change, this actually offers protection. Because it says, it offers you the religious protection that whatever you have deemed that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's what your religion says. So nobody can come and force you to perform that sacrament otherwise.
And to be clear, we are not changing.
We are not
changing the Marriage Act. We're not.
There is no attempt.
Yeah.
But it still comes to mind because looking at some of the videos of the consultations, they're heavily serious, especially when it comes to that. And this might be of me to ask, but at what point? Because it's clear. You're saying it's clear. But if you go to a consultation, there's somebody of a naysayer. At what point was there a mix-up there, being that it's clear?
I will approach this very cautiously.
Please do.
I think the human nature is that when there's something new, naturally there's fear. And part of the reason we've produced a simple guide to the legislation is that the legislation is a comprehensive piece of legislation, and there are provisions in it that if you read it without thinking of all of the ways in which legislation is connected and has to be read as a whole, you may miss things. And much the same way that it's necessary to read, if you are a person of faith, you read your religious text as a whole. And so the legislation...
But could it be timing too? Because I think it was only like a week before that Court of Appeal upheld, and the LGBT community said they would potentially look at exploring same-sex marriage.
And it got that added, I will say, that added to the anxiety. But this is something that has been on, we could not predict the time of the Court of Appeal's judgment. We had been working for some time now and in earnest, like for instance, just to help with the timeline, we actually got cabinet sanction to draft this legislation February 26, 2019. And so the drafting has been moved, and Mr. Brathwaite's consultancy is also time bound. So in terms of, I will say that indeed I think that judgment heightened people's anxiety and suspicion and so forth. But really, we had no control over the Court of Appeal's judgment.
This was very publicly announced in terms of the champion of the legislation by the National AIDS Commission on February 28th as well.
But I don't want to mislead people either, that one of the identified vulnerable groups includes sexual orientation.
Absolutely.
So can you speak to that in terms of how that impacts other laws as well?
Right. So the legislation looking at, starting from the discrimination, the component of discrimination and stigma, we can't address HIV without looking at the key affected groups and providing protections in that regard. And so the legislation provides, for example, that in employment, that a person cannot be terminated based on their sexual orientation unless there is some legitimate reason for a person's sexual orientation to be a relevant consideration. And so religious bodies under this legislation, they have discretion for anything that is done in conformity with their religious beliefs or tenets. And this could include inherent. So it may matter for a religious organization, not just the question of sexual orientation, but marital status. Are you single? Are you divorced? Are you cohabiting? That might be a matter of consideration. And so the legislation says, ultimately, to bring this back to kind of a bigger picture of how can people of diverse experiences live in community. And I've been using this metaphor of an umbrella. And so if we're in this very confined space, exposed to the element, if I hold up my umbrella, I might not be able to hold it straight up if somebody's right next to me.
Yeah.
You know, we tilt a little. And so the legislation provides a lot of provisions about that balancing. We've provided a factor to determine in terms of the exceptions. You may have different and less favorable conduct in an area that is regulated on the basis of a protected characteristic, but there may be an exception that is applicable to you. And then we've also provided for an exemption. Part of the exemptions framework is about fundamentally about notice and fairness. So we've heard concerns about, you know, a small bed and breakfast who may be owned by persons of faith, and they might say, look, we'd prefer only to rent 2 married couples in a room. That's fine, and you make a notice of that. But what ought not to happen is that a person flies quite down to Toledo or Dangriga to then be met on arrival with, look, we're sorry, we can't take
Where
you.
there's no written policy in place.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that's then a question of notice. Fundamentally, that's about fairness.
Okay, clear.
So let's talk about the protected characteristics, and that's an interesting term in itself. So we're not classifying groups. We're just saying that you may possess one or some of these issues and be discriminated based on them. So we're talking about age, we're talking about breastfeeding, disability, family responsibilities, gender identity, HIV positive status, intersex status, lawful sexual activity, marital status, maternity, political opinion, pregnancy, race, religious belief or activity or lack thereof, sex, sexual orientation, status as a person who's experiencing or has experienced domestic violence, status as an orphan, and any other status.
So let's perhaps start with any other status.
Yes. So
the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it provides a range of protected characteristics, and it concludes likewise with any other status. What we do is we provide a framework for the possible expansion of categories where it is necessary to do so.
Yeah.
And other status, a person can qualify under the framework of other status where it is discrimination that results in systemic discrimination. So this is ultimately a group question. It results in discrimination that undermines human dignity, and also it must be, the nature of it must be of similar seriousness as the other protected characteristics. And so we've heard concerns about maybe you should provide protection for irrelevant criminal record. So, you know, as societies, we can be unforgiving. And so a person has served their time and finds it impossible to get a job because you have to go to the police and you have to request your police certificate of character, regardless of the nature of the crime. You know, thankfully, Belize has moved on the expungement of convictions in relation to marijuana. But there are other, you know, there are a whole range of offenses that might be irrelevant to the job. Other status.
but that's not included.
Other status provides a framework for that to be included. As so, if that came before the commission and the tribunal, a determination could be made that this is another status.
But if it's a relevant issue, why not include it?
And we're working on it.
And it's a partly policy decision as well. So we're looking at, but an important part with, you know, that Mr. Brathwaite had raised that I thought was very important in the past. With this other status, sometimes in frameworks, sexual orientation, etc., is brought under that. But we thought that it was important because we did not want to, as you said, put poison in the kettle. We wanted to be open. That was brought up quite clearly because we want people to see the full extent of what we're dealing with, because there's nothing to hide. All of this is based on reality and data
Well, and I think that that's, and even as reading the list, I know that there are people reacting to some of the issues on the list. Sexual orientation is only one. I think gender identity or transgender
Yeah.
is something very new for the conversation in Belize. Intersex is also one. I'm trying to see what else is there.
Lawful sexual activity.
Lawful sexual activity. So let's
Provides
tackle these
yeah.
issues.
So lawful sexual activity is included in the CARICOM model bill, and it's better, I've explained this with reference to what it doesn't cover.
Well, I was going to say lawful sexual activity has changed in terms of the ruling for Section 53,
Yeah.
but there's certain things that remain the same.
Right.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, lawful sexual activity need not be thought of in relation to sexual orientation because there's explicit protection there. Lawful sexual activity in a culture and an era where, kind of revenge porn exists in the way in which people's private, intimate moments are leaked. So that's what's referred to as revenge. And where it is that is an irrelevant consideration to a working environment, that's lawful sexual activity. We've had, looking at it internationally, cases where persons work at competing companies and they are in a relationship and they've been terminated on that basis. And then lawful sexual activity can include sex work, speaking to the reality that there is high
Is sex work legal in Belize?
So that's a kind of technical question where Belize's legislation does not prohibit the selling of sex. It
Does not prohibit.
Does not.
selling.
If you are an autonomous sex worker, it prohibits everything else around it, like pimping, pandering, keeping a brothel, etc. But if you decide that personally, this is what you are going to do, and there is no madam, etc., then it is
Working for yourself.
working for
I mean,
yourself. If you're an
there's a bit of
entrepreneur,
oddity
autonomous-
in terms of selling is allowed, but buying is restricted. So that that's a later conversation. It's an odd legal framework. I agree.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the legislation provides that if regarded as lawful, that when it comes to accessing insurance, when it comes to accessing banking facilities, that a person shouldn't be discriminated on that basis. It's intersex status, simply where a person is born with biological characteristics of both sexes. So you may be born with ovaries and testes, and that's often...
Which is scientifically possible.
Yes.
It does exist.
And it exists in Belize.
Yes.
Because as I go, since I've known some of the stories and I'm hearing more stories now with this of, parents making decisions about this biological and then finding out that maybe it was the wrong choice right here in Belize. People face discrimination in terms of access to medical care, etc. So.
Wow.
And then gender identity, the ways in which people express their sense of masculinity or femininity. So including transgender community and starting from the framework of HIV and the high levels of prevalence is important. And if I can spend a little time on just breaking down the connection. If a person cannot work, if a person cannot access housing, the person will turn to other means to get housing and to get food. And so if you're able to allow persons the space to live and thrive in employment, to allow them to access education, so where it is that you may have a case of a student who's deprived of education because they may express themselves differently, then that translates into not being able to work, not being able to live, and so ultimately the society is driving that individual towards risky choices that result in higher levels of HIV prevalence. A concern here is that single-sex schools will remain single-sex schools determined on a biological basis.
So it means that if there's someone who wants to go to an all-girls school, they can't use the Equal Opportunities Bill to say, I should be allowed to go there.
No, so a biological boy can't apply to St. Catherine.
To St. Catherine, okay.
No matter how he expresses himself.
And for sure, there this is
So-
a tricky area.
Yes,
It
and that's
is.
what I wanted to get at, because as I said, some of these are introducing new concepts into a public conversation where perhaps maybe healthcare workers, counselors, or some of the school systems have encountered them on a smaller basis. How do you, and I'm sure this has probably been one of the bigger issues that you've had to bring up to people, that putting transgender or gender inequality in a legislation is something that perhaps people are not comfortable with because they don't want to accept that it exists in the country. So how does this apply? Why is it necessary to put it in the legislation?
Because the kinds of discrimination exists, and because the state has a duty
Yeah.
to allow, to ensure that nobody is discriminated against. And a big part of this with the commission is also education. I think that's an important function in terms of doing the work to help people to understand these different manifestations and to understand the interconnectedness of things, as Mr. Brathwaite just pointed out. I mean, it's more than, okay, so you can't go to school. It's how that drives everything else and how it drives you underground and how that then impacts on society as a whole.
Yeah.
And we're trying to respect that everybody, everybody's umbrella, but everybody needs an umbrella in the first instance, and that's the duty of the state, that we can ensure and try to, as best as possible, ensure that your freedoms are not unduly, are not infringed upon. But the fact remains that just because you come from a different ideology, or you pray differently, or you believe that this is a sin, the state does not have the luxury then of saying, well, we're not going to protect sinners according to your doctrines.
Well, and in fact, I think one of the things that I've seen, I suppose as a result of the consultation, is where you're going at great lengths to show how religious beliefs are actually being protected through the Equal Opportunities Bill. I have one example of looking at dreadlocks. And that has been a continuous part of the conversation. Rastafarianism is a religion. And I think in the last census, we had about 500 people that identified. I don't know what this latest census will say. But talk about protections there, because it's not that religious groups that have very specific beliefs are being robbed of those beliefs. They're in fact having a bit of reinforcement with the bill.
Exactly. So we've heard all sorts of, especially people of faith, and I understand this, saying, will I still be allowed to preach? I'm a street preacher. Will I be able to put up and tell people of the LGBT community that they're on the wrong path? And we're like, yes, that's protected. You just have to, if your municipality wants you to get a license to use the public space, or you're free to do that. Get your license, set up your thing, and because freedom of speech, expression, and freedom of religion is protected.
It is,
You did not include hate speech.
We did not include hate speech.
Do you feel the country is just not ready for that type of legislation?
So firstly, the criminal code already provides some protections in relation to threats of grievous bodily harm and so murder, etc. So there's some protection there.
But it didn't include rape. We found that out very recently.
So some protections are provided already in that regard, and we felt as though the protections in the circumstances were adequate, and otherwise that would now be a much broader discussion. And if we can just circle back to protection of religious beliefs, there is a diversity of religion. So whether that's denominational diversity or other smaller religious communities, the state has an obligation to protect all of these forms of religion. So whether that is traditional religions, whether that is established religions, emerging religions, the state has a duty to provide those protections. And fundamentally, that's part of this conversation has been about what duty does the state have in regulating sin within a tradition? And we've used the example of, look, fornication is very much legal, and regardless of whether it's considered sin.
Which means sex outside of marriage.
Sex outside
is
of marriage.
legal.
But we've recognized in the Family and Children's Act that persons who are born outside of wedlock need protection regardless of their conception.
Yeah.
We've recognized that cohabiting unions,
Yeah.
so
After
people
5
who've
years,
lived together for 5 years, even if unmarried, that they require the protection of the law.
Yeah.
And so the state provides this balancing exercise of umbrellas. And what we've attempted to highlight to people of faith is that it is important that your right to engage and to share your truth with others is protected, so that even if a behavior that you disagree with from a position of faith, that you engage with persons and you bring them to your light.
Yeah.
And that's what's important that we've protected.
Can you respond to my dreadlocks question? So if I'm a Rastafarian
Yeah.
and I have dreadlocks and my workplace doesn't allow it,
This legislation provides protection.
because
If-
that is my religious belief. That's
Because
a part
that
of
is
my
a
religious
religious
belief.
belief.
We actually have the case of Imhotep Diego
Yeah.
recently, who sought judicial review,
Which is a child,
which
right?
is a child in a school, because he has been growing
His dreadlocks.
his dreadlocks since birth, basically, and
Yeah.
it's a part of his spiritual and cultural identity. And he was being forced to cut his hair to comply with the
School
and
rules, yeah.
he actually sought judicial review and won his case.
Wow.
And let me say that it could provide protection. Now, of course, everything is a case-by-case assessment.
Yeah.
And
You'd have to prove.
And you may have, let's say that you may have a legitimate interest in a workplace where long hair could be a health and safety threat. Now, your aim here is safety. The legislation requires that there be a legitimate aim, that there be a measure that's connected to that, and that there be no less restrictive means
Yeah.
of achieving that. Where it is that the aim might be noble, safety, the question is, might a helmet, might another way of covering the hair not provide that protection?
Yeah.
And this is a Caribbean-wide conversation
Yes.
about the
Yeah.
politics of hair,
Yeah.
and so the legislation does provide potentially greater protection. But again, I just wanted to highlight that this is a case-by-case assessment.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
blanket.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
not
It's- it
once.
isn't. And that's why I'll say it again, I love the role of the commission and the positive obligations, because it's really heading things off at the pass.
Yeah.
So it's really working towards more positive frameworks, so the same way we worked on the issue of HIV in the workplace and what does our workplace, how, these frameworks and guidelines for workplaces to be more inclusive and to reduce stigma and discrimination. It's the same way. What does an equal opportunities workplace look like? And you start to look at these frameworks. So because sometimes people are not even aware, it's not malice or malintent. It's just like a lack of awareness, or helping people to think through creatively.
Or a paradigm shift
some
sometimes
of
in
these
what we're
things.
used
So
to.
that I think is a really valuable piece. The commission and its work in trying to set the stage so that we create these enabling environments. So we don't have to go to dispute resolution, and we certainly wouldn't have to go to the courts even.
So just two final points. One, what's been the engagement with the private sector? Because they have a very large stake
Yeah.
in this.
Absolutely. I think we definitely, I know. There have been conversations, but there definitely needs to be more.
Okay.
Especially since now we have the draft, we have, to look at some of the specific issues that they will be thinking about.
Yeah.
And that input is going to be invaluable as
Yeah.
we walk this line, because we were talking about, like for instance, the difference between maybe catering and just restaurant and food. So those kinds of things, the same way the difference between a bed and breakfast being run by the example of the bed and breakfast as opposed to a chain hotel,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know, that kind of thing. So I think that it'll be invaluable.
So that's the next phase of your
discussions.
consultations?
Yeah, we definitely are doing
Yeah.
smaller group
Okay.
discussions after
Okay.
these public consultations.
And is this a consultation that will allow for changes to be made based on feedback?
Change is already being made.
Yeah, I've been as I moved around the country, I've highlighted a personal value for me, and that's a generosity of spirit, and that means that our consultations are genuine. And so the changes were included in the first draft based on the consultations that I had. I've been to Belize in August and November. I've met with the Chamber of Commerce, for example. I've met with other commercial institutions, the insurance industry, supervisor of insurance, for example. And so we're very happy and receptive of how do we make this legislation not the perfect piece of legislation, but a stronger piece of legislation that is more apt for Belize's context. And so, submissions can be made to the National AIDS Commission. Hopefully we can display the website where, the email address and website where those can be made. And those are open until the 31st of January. And then if the bill goes to, has to go to cabinet and then to the National.
What's the timeline for that?
Once it closes, the consultation, our comments period closes at the 31st of January, then we'll really look at where we are. I think we have to go back as the Anti-Discrimination Steering Committee and look at this, because it's very important that we get this right. And so that's why I'm not closing off that we will continue consultations with small groups, because we have to get it right.
Of course.
It's such an important piece. It's such a forward-looking
Yeah.
piece of legislation, and it can do quite a bit for our community and our society, and it's important that we get it right.
Yeah. Well, we are completely out of time. We want to thank you for coming in to have this conversation. We touched on some of the issues, but I know that if you contact the National AIDS Commission, you can get an electronic copy and even some of the guidelines that you've put out already. So thank
Yeah.
you so much for
Thank
coming
you,
in.
guys.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
having us.
All right, once again, the closing date for feedback on the draft is January 31st, so you have to send in those comments before that date. We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking about international customs day, so stay tuned.
Years ago, Don Noyo started with one bar and a vision to capture the taste of Belize and share it with
And welcome back, welcome back. It is a cool Wednesday morning, hump day. And we're now venturing off into our second conversation for the morning, International Customs Day. And we've got senior customs officers in to talk to us about it. Edel Makakam is here along with Lauren Fraser. They're both senior custom officers. Guys, good morning and welcome.
Morning.
Good morning.
She feels cool. You feel cool, you feel cool.
Yeah, I'm cool.
No,
I'm cool.
we want to, let's jump on into it. International Customs Day, what is this about and how long so far we've been celebrating International Customs Day?
Okay, so first of all, we just like to give you a warm thank you on behalf of the Comptroller of Customs and the entire staff for giving us this opportunity to come here today to talk to you about International Customs Day.
Yeah.
So, like you mentioned, on the 26th of January every year, the World Customs Organization and its 183 member customs administration worldwide celebrate International Customs Day. Now, for you to understand what is it, you know, I just want to give you a brief history of what is World Customs Organization.
Sure.
So World Customs Organization, and you will probably hear us just referring to it as WCO. It was first established in 1952, and it was established under the name the Customs Council Corporation, the Customs Corporation Council. Now, the mission of this council was basically to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of customs administration worldwide.
Yeah.
And it went on ahead in 1994, and that is when it adopted the name the World Customs Organization. So what basically they do is they provide its members with international instruments, and this sets out the procedure under which customs administration worldwide can adopt so that they can harmonize all the procedures worldwide. And they also provide us with technical assistance and service training, and they enhance the capacity of the staff of these administration. Now, Belize have become a member of this international body on the 22nd of April 2008. So since 2008, we have become a member of the World Customs Organization.
Wow.
And so this
And
year,
what's been the implication since you have become a part of this group?
Like I mentioned, the instrument, the international instrument sets out the procedure or the guidelines under which we work. And so basically it's there for you to adopt as an administration because they want to make sure that the procedure is harmonized worldwide.
Yeah.
So wherever you go and you're doing business, you're expected to see the same procedure being carried out by customs administration. And so, yes, we have joined and we have benefited very much from capacity building from this organization.
You know, on a day like World Customs Day, it really gives us an opportunity to understand more about the role that you play in our society. And while very often your customs officer is somebody who you either really love or really don't like, and just based on being able to enforce regulations that already exist. So talk to us about, when you explain to people how important the role of the Customs Department is in the larger context of the country's development. How do you explain that to people?
And so basically that's what ties into the theme.
Yeah.
Because every year we celebrate this day under a theme. So now this year it is customs fostering sustainability for people, prosperity, and the planet. And so, you know, everybody is going eco-friendly and green. And so this is where. So basically, when we're going to go about explaining what the theme means, we're also going to be highlighting what is it that we do in terms of contributing to these actions, because they're actually actions. And so the first one is saying we're fostering sustainability for people. Now, how do we protect our citizens? When you think about custom, people say, oh, how do you protect people? All you do is you look in people's luggage and their bags and you take away our stuff. But this is basically our way of protecting the citizen because we have what is referred to as agency duties. So everything that comes in that could negatively affect the citizen of the country is restricted in some way or the other by different government agencies. And so we have to make sure that we have this very tight interagency cooperation. So, like for instance, the Belize Agriculture and Health Authority, they are specifically responsible for plant and animal health. And so everything that comes in respect of food, whether it's plant or animal, they are the ones who are responsible to say, okay, this is able to come in, this cannot come in because there's some plant disease, there's animal disease. So we are the frontline officers, they are the examination port, and we have to make sure that these approvals are in place before we release this cargo, because we don't want these food to be get on the market and then people get contaminated, and then you know it's the health of the citizen. And so it's these agencies. We have like FIU, so they fight against transnational crime and terrorism, money laundering, financial crime, and so we have to make sure that we partner with them to say whenever we're examining any cargo, we're checking a vehicle at the port of entry, there's large amount of money coming in that people cannot really ascertain as to where the source of income is. So we have to make sure that we get in contact with them, we follow their procedures to make sure that these monies are not used to fund these terrorism acts, because it's not only about protecting the people within Belize, but protecting people overall.
Of course.
And we have the police department, and so they're responsible for the illegal importation of firearms, arms, bombs, illicit drugs. And so whenever we come in contact, we're not exporting these things, so we have to make sure that we rely on the expertise of these departments to say, okay, this is how you're going to deal when you come in contact with arms and ammunition. These are the requirements. If you want to bring it legally, you know, you need your permit from the Commissioner of Police, you need your letter saying that you have been approved to have a gun license. And so they literally lay out these procedures that we're going to use to make sure that our people within the country are protected.
Of course.
You know, and I think what you have stated is so important, because so often we just look at a customs officer at what they may or may not charge you in terms of taxes entering into the country with specific goods. But you're such a critical check and balance at entry points in being able to ensure that some of the really negative things don't come into the country, don't go beyond that port itself. Baja is a really great example. I mean, we don't want many of the diseases that can be brought in, and you are there tasked to ensure that you can prevent it as best as possible. So when you talk about it from that perspective, it really shows how critical your role is. I want to talk about locally how you work within the institution to uphold the standards that are important to making sure people see the integrity in what you do.
Okay, so that would tie in with prosperity, which is the second part of the team. And so that also have external cooperation, and we have internal system that helps us to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do.
Yes, when it comes to prosperity and our role in contributing to locally in our country, customs is tasked with upholding fair trade practices, and through that customs itself too is responsible for contributing to economic growth by us being responsible for more than 50% of what the revenue that's collected annually is expected. That's one of our main traditional roles. Our other traditional role is enforcement. When you see our officers out there doing checkpoints and being in those remote areas, and it's not just because they want to take away your bear or wanting to be mean, but it also contributes to local investment. For example, your Boyne and Boyne group, who employs many people, all right, them giving them locals opportunity to have their jobs. So that's one way, and also in them fostering prosperity and trade practices. We try to promote legitimate trade practices, and that's being rewarded through our trusted trader programs, where companies signed up, and they get faster release times. They get less intervention by customs. We also, from within our own mechanism, we have faster release times eventually saves companies or businesses time in storage costs and stuff like that. And so the inception of Asikuda allows faster declarations, faster payment opportunities. And we also support other agencies such as the Beltrade, which deals in their small business development center with their micro, small, medium enterprise operations, where we support them in technical support with they are promoting packaging materials to reduce the cost for local investors. So we promote investment in that way. Also, we support the Directorate of Foreign Trade, where who try to seek market access for local producers and stuff, traders with when we support them in bilateral agreements, when they go to negotiate bilateral agreements, your regional agreements such as CARICOM. We recently participated in trade negotiations, I think, out there in Taiwan. There's currently negotiations taking place in Mexico, and these entities rely a lot on what customs technical support. So, and that's how we promote growth or economic growth. And we also have internal thing to try to prevent commercial fraud, such as under invoicing and stuff like that, where our valuation sections, they try. It's a hard thing, but we try our best with what we have.
Definitely. You know, that's one of the things, because people try their best to weave what customs actually levy on. I think the relationship between the populace and customs must be one together. It has to be 100. Because people still see customs officers as basically the enemy. Like you see them, they want to take away your thing, they want this and that. And I think people need to understand, especially the economical aspect of things, that if you bring something from across the border and you try to smuggle that in, somebody is being danged at the bottom of the chain. And like you mentioned with Bowen & Bowen, it's over 1,500 employees that they've got. So if you bring things in, it actually knocks that part of things as well. Now let's talk about...
But it's also looking at the issue of equality. And I think we don't talk about that very often. While I may have the luxury to travel and purchase something at a reduced cost, someone in Belize who didn't get the chance to travel, even just across the border, has to pay the tax on it. And it's only fair that we have the same price that we're paying. Do you think people see that as the bigger picture?
No, and that is the reason why we like to take this opportunity to inform people of what is it that we do. Because basically they figure we make up these procedures as we go along and we're just trying to be mean. But we do it not only cater to people, but we contribute to economic development. And in terms of economic development, we have to make sure that the government are getting their fair revenue. Because the revenue that they receive is put right back into society, the building of the schools and the hospitals and different things. So it's not just giving them money, but money that would go back into society. And protecting our local investors to make sure that the business can grow, to make sure that they can provide jobs. And these are some of the things that they don't look at when we're telling them, no, you're not allowed to bring this in, you're not allowed. And then basically, what is it? It's government, it's an agency duty that we're doing, because like I said, our primary function is collecting the revenue and protecting the revenue. And so when you're dealing with items that need that are restricted, it's a supplies control function. And so when you're bringing items that are restricted that depletes the ozone layer or are detrimental to the environment, it's a Department of Environment, and so we get the blame for doing all these functions on behalf of these other agencies. But we understand the reason why we do it, and we know what's a contribution to our country. And so it makes it easier for us. But
Yeah.
people not understanding doesn't make it easy.
Yeah.
Look, the educational aspect of things must comes in, and this is
Yeah.
where we always have the problem of the populace not understanding the role of the customs or departments in a whole. Which brings me to ask, being that we've got International Customs Day coming up, which is what date?
January
And what's
26th.
and what's going to happen on that
Okay,
day?
so it's the 26th, but the 26th is on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So what we had decided to do was to start our week of activity starting on Monday and culminating on Friday. So on Monday we had the opening prayer service with the staff. So
Okay.
in all things you do, you need to give thanks to God.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Waking up every day and having a job to put food on your table.
Yeah.
So that's what we did. Yesterday we coordinated with Sister Cecilia Home, and a couple staff members went and helped in the preparation of the food and the serving of the food yesterday. This evening, we're partnering up with
Salvation Army.
Salvation Army, and so we're going to be dealing with the preparation of the food, and then later on at 8 p.m. we're going to be out there serving the food to the homeless. So that's part of our social activity, giving back to the community.
Yes.
Tomorrow is for the staff, so we're having a social. So it's giving back to the staff now for the hard tasks that they do every day. And on Friday is the reason why we're here, which is our customs information fair.
Nice.
So like the tax fair, it is a customs fair that is open. It will be at the Civic Center in the parking lot, and we're starting at 9 a.m. And after the opening ceremony, we're going to be having, we're inviting everyone to come and visit our booths.
Yeah.
We're going to be having the different units within customs. So if you want to learn about valuation, maybe you want to bring in a vehicle,
Yeah.
if you want to know how many taxes or what type of taxes you pay
Yeah.
when you come in through the borders or the airport, what you're entitled to, what is restricted, what you're not supposed to bring, what you can bring, what your allowances. All these, the booths are out there available for all these questions. But because of the theme that we are fostering sustainability for people and we're the planet and prosperity, we're also inviting those agencies that are closely linked with the team. So we're
nice.
looking at BAHA, the
DOE.
Department of Environment, especially the Department of Environment, because you know they're phasing out
Single-use
of the
plastic.
single-use plastics.
Yeah.
And so people do not understand, well, I'm hoping that they're understanding what's going to happen or the implication of this phase out. So for those small businesses who use these containers, they can come and get information on what's happening, what's the phase out process, and what's going to happen in terms of what would be their next option.
Yeah.
And so we're having them, we're having
Think
the-
Beltrade.
from Beltrade, it's the Small
Small
Business Development
Development
Center.
Center.
And specifically, they're going to speak on their program, which is the micro, small, medium enterprise, and how you can register with them in order to bring in your packaging and your labeling material duty free.